All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. We're in the home stretch of the last chapter, and I'm on page 888 and 889, figure 2512, how to work with controls. So the author mentions, now you know how to send data from a controller to a view, how to work with data once it gets to the view, but the simple views you've seen so far only display data. In a real-world MVC app, you need to interact with users through controls on a form, and you need to be able to work with form data once the form is posted to the server. In a web forms app, you use server controls to interact with users. These server controls aren't available in ASP.NET MVC. Rather, you can use HTML and Razor to add input and selected fields, or you can use what are called MVC HTML helpers. Those helpers are summarized in the table that you see on the screen right here, where you've got the HTML helper that you use and then the corresponding HTML. These helpers are used with model binding, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. All right. Then we've got some examples here. These first two examples that you see show how to add a form element with a drop-down list to a page. All right, so here's how you do it using Razor, and here's how you do it using HTML helpers. They will both do the same thing, but it's, two sides of the same coin, or whatever you want to call it. It's just two different ways of doing the same thing. The next two examples that are shown here show how to create a quantity text box and a product ID hidden field. So these MVC HTML helpers are similar to server controls in web forms. Most of these helpers have a second version that you can use with them. All right? The version is used on the model binding, which we'll talk about again at the end of the chapter. Pause for a minute here. All right, sorry about that. I had another instructor come in and ask for some printer paper. So, pages 890 and 891 discuss how to work with redirection. And it says here, if your application has more than one page, you'll need to navigate or add navigation links to your pages. You'll also need to redirect in code, such as processing a postback. To provide navigation links, you can use traditional HTML anchor elements or the HTML.ActionLink helper that's shown here. A benefit of using the helper is you don't need to worry about getting the relative URL correct. Rather, you provide the name of the controller and the name of the action method, and the MVC routing framework will take care of the rest. This figure shows how to create a navigation link using the HTML.ActionLink method, and it provides comments to kind of show you what's going on. The arguments parameter is how you can add attributes to the anchor element here. To redirect in code, you use one of the redirect methods that are shown in the table of the figure here. Okay? The redirect permanent requires a full URL, and it's most often used if you're going to be linking to an external URL. The redirect to route permanent requires a full route directory object, and the redirect to action permanent requires an action method name, and it can be overloaded. So when you want to redirect between controllers, you use the redirect to action method. The parameter for this is optional, all right, if you're redirecting to an action method in the same controller, but it's usually best to include it just for consistency's sake and to make it clear what you're doing. When a form is submitted, ASP.NET MVC apps commonly use what's called the PRG pattern. I don't know if that's shown next or not. The PRG stands for Post Redirect Get. And it does this to avoid the back button and refresh problems that we talked about back in, geez, that was back in chapter 21, I believe it was. Yeah, chapter 21, when we discussed, if you remember, problems with back button control. This also is done to separate the post responsibility of sending data to the server from the get responsibility of retrieving data from the server. All right, so the example that you see here, once I remove this, so the example that you see here it shows an example of the PRG pattern in the cart controller, okay? So the PRG, the post redirect get pattern, is recommended with ASP.NET MVC. You can pass data from the post action to the get action using what's called the temp data object, and that's exactly what's being done here. All right. Pages 892 and 893 discuss how to add postback functionality with jQuery. And what's mentioned there is a handy feature of ASP.NET Web Forms is that you can set the auto postback attribute of controls such as drop-down lists and checkboxes to true. That makes these controls initiate a postback when their value changes. Although this isn't available in ASP.NET MVC, it's easy, again, easy is a relative term, but easy to add using the jQuery as shown here. With this code, all you need to do is add auto postback functionality to your controls. All you need to do to add it is to add a class attribute with its value set to postback, such as what's shown right here. All right. So to help you work with data that's posted back from this back to the server, ASP.NET MVC stores the data in what's called a form collection object. This is a name value collection that stores things as key value pairs where the key is the element name. So the code that's shown here is the form collection object that shows the order controller. This order controller has two index action methods, one that handles the post and one that handles the get. Although it doesn't use the form, collection object in this case, okay, what the get does here, just so you know, is it checks the temp data object for a select list called products. If it's not there, it gets a list of products from the order model and creates a new select list by sending in the list the name of the value field and the name of the display field. Then it checks the ID URL parameter. If there isn't one, it gets the ID, so in other words, it's working in unison here. So the form collection object is a name value collection object that contains the string values of the elements of a form that has been posted to the server. All right. Now, there are some problems with this approach as mentioned on pages 894 and 895 in figure 2515. It says there are two problems with this approach. First, you have to remember the name of the controls in the view and manually type the names in the controller, which requires switching between the two files, which can introduce errors. Second, it means that the controller also needs to know the details about your view. And that makes it more tightly coupled than what you want. The solution to this, and unfortunately they only give it to you in the last couple pages in the text, is to work with model binding. You can think of model binding as your controller's post-action method strongly typed. First, in the view, you bind the controls to the model using HTML4 helpers. All right. in the figure here, it shows, it shows the quantity text box. I guess it's right here. And the product ID field are both shown, and they're rewritten to use the HTML text for and hidden for helpers. Now this can be kind of hard to follow because it uses what's called a lambda syntax. In other words, the expression is telling the helper which property of the model to bind to. Okay? Then in the post method, you change the object passed to the method from the control object to the type of the view's model property. Again, this is pretty heavy stuff. So when you work with the form collection object, you need to remember the names of the view's controls, which can lead to typos and other errors. Model binding lets you post the view model of the strongly typed view directly to the controller and then work with the view model instead. Model binding provides IntelliSense when working with the data posted from the view, and it also keeps your controller from having to know anything about how the view is constructed. In other words, it decouples, all right? Which means if you make changes to one thing, it shouldn't have radical changes on the other. Now that is it. So in here we talked about the model view controller pattern. There were several lectures, as you just heard. All right, we explained how the MVC pattern improves application development. We went over the optional view model. We talked about the sequence in which these are developed: application, then model, then controller, then view, then model, then controller, then view, for as many as you need for the application. We described the use of the Razor engine and routing in an ASP.NET MVC app. We described the use of HTML controls, helpers, and layout views. We described the use of redirection and the PRG pattern in a controller of an ASP.NET MVC application. We described the use of strongly typed views and model binding in an ASP.NET application. What I'm planning on doing next, this is an FYI for you, but what I'm planning on doing next is literally this create an MVC app in an hour. I've gone through this already, but what I'd like to do is go over what's in here. What they do is they build over, I think it's 1, 5, 11, 12, like 14 lessons. They go over how to build a very simple ASP.NET app, and they even deploy it, all right? And they go through some stuff, a lot heavier than stuff I've ever gone over, but I'd like to go through that, all right? Then I'd like to go through either the example that's in here, or probably at least first, this example of how to create a movie database app in 15 minutes. Then this one that is in here, the one that's there, goes through the same movie database, but in much more depth and breadth of coverage. And I'd like to do all that. I don't know if I've got it in me or whatever. All right. Finally, and I'm showing you this rather than creating another video. And that is, what I have done is I have created, and I don't know where it is right now, unfortunately. I think it's here, but I could be wrong. For another class that I teach, which is AWD1111, Web Technologies, I created this simple website. All right. I moved to the Wentzville, Missouri area in July of 2015. Since that time, my future son-in-law has been trying to get me into hockey, which I've never been into. All right. So he wants me to become a Blues fan. So I'm becoming a Blues fan. And I've created this St. Louis Blues line. That's a little joke because there's a blue line. All right. And here's the home page. Here's a simple about page. And here's a contact page. All right. And I've created that first time I created it, I used just simple HTML. Okay. Then I went back and created not exactly the same site, but pretty much the same site. And I did that I created that same site, but I did it using Bootstrap. All right, and I'm looking for it right now, and unfortunately I can't find the site. And then finally I went back and created the site one last time. And when I created the site one last time, here it is in Bootstrap. Okay? So it's not exactly the same, but it looks pretty similar. And I can jump to different pages that are in here. Finally, I went back and used a product that's called MobiRise. And using MobiRise, I went back, I've got to find that one. And I created the site one last time. That's not it. And I created this one last time using the MobiRise product. Okay? Okay, just added a junk page in there. But what I'd like to do is kind of go back and do a hybrid of these and create that using ASP.NET. So I'm going to do a couple MVC examples, then I'm going to come back and as a big project, I'm going to create the St. Louis Blues Line website, and I'm going to create it using ASP.NET. All right? And that's what the remainder of these lectures or videos will be about.